Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. No American president had ever done what Franklin Roosevelt was about to do. In January 1943, with a world war raging on 3 continents, Roosevelt boarded a plane for the first time in his presidency, for the first time since taking office a decade earlier, and flew across the Atlantic Ocean into a war zone. He told the press corps he was going fishing. He told almost no one the truth. His destination was Casablanca, Morocco, still within range of German bombers. His purpose was to meet Winston Churchill and decide how the war would be fought and how it would end. And on the final day of that meeting, Roosevelt would utter 2 words that would shape the rest of the 20th century: unconditional surrender. It was a phrase borrowed from the Civil War, spoken in a Moroccan garden, and it would determine the fate of nations. Picture this. It's the evening of January 14th, 1943. A convoy of cars winds through the darkened streets of Casablanca, past checkpoints manned by American soldiers who have no idea who they're protecting. Fighter planes circle overhead. Barbed wire surrounds the Anfa Hotel, where guards stand every 20 feet. Inside one of the villas, 2 men sit drinking and smoking. Franklin Roosevelt, 60 years old, paralyzed from the waist down, has just completed a journey of over 5,000 miles, by train to Miami, by flying boat to Trinidad, across the South Atlantic to Brazil, then across the ocean to West Africa, and finally north to Morocco. It has taken him 5 days. No president has ever left the country during wartime. No president has ever visited Africa. No president since Abraham Lincoln has visited an active war zone. Roosevelt has just done all 3, and the American press corps has no idea he's gone. Back in Washington, his staff maintains the fiction that he's on a fishing trip. The Secret Service has gone to extraordinary lengths to keep the journey secret. Casablanca is still within range of German bombers. If the Nazis learned that both Roosevelt and Churchill were in the same location, the temptation to strike would be overwhelming. Across from Roosevelt sits Winston Churchill, 68 years old, who has been fighting this war since 1939, 3 years before America joined. Churchill has flown in from London, where German bombs still fall. The 2 men have met before, but never like this, in a war zone, with the fate of the world on the table, with no one watching except their closest advisors. They will talk until 3 in the morning. They will argue about strategy, about timing, about who should command what. And somewhere in these conversations, Roosevelt will begin thinking about something else entirely. How should this war end? Let me build the clock for you, because the Casablanca conference didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a specific moment when everything was in flux. Just 2 months earlier, in November 1942, American and British forces had landed in North Africa. Operation Torch. It was the first major American ground offensive against Nazi Germany, and it was going badly. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was still fighting. Allied forces were bogged down in Tunisia. Victory was not yet certain. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the most brutal battle in human history was reaching its climax. At Stalingrad, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were locked in a death struggle that would ultimately cost over 2 million casualties. Stalin had been invited to Casablanca but couldn't leave. His country was fighting for survival. This was the problem Roosevelt and Churchill needed to solve. What comes next? The Americans, led by General George Marshall, wanted to invade France as soon as possible, a direct strike at Germany's heart. Churchill and the British wanted to continue in the Mediterranean, invading Sicily and Italy first. They argued that the Allies weren't ready for France, that an invasion across the English Channel in 1943 would be a disaster. For 10 days, the military chiefs argued. The Americans pushed for France, the British pushed back. In the end, Churchill got what he wanted. Sicily first, then Italy. The invasion of France, what would become D-Day, would have to wait until 1944. But that wasn't the decision that would echo through history. Roosevelt had been thinking about endings. He remembered the last war, the war his generation had called the Great War, before this one made that name obsolete. He remembered how it ended, with an armistice, a ceasefire, German troops marching home with their weapons. And he remembered what came after, the stab-in-the-back myth, the claim so effectively exploited by Adolf Hitler that Germany had never really been defeated on the battlefield, that it had been betrayed by politicians, by Jews, by communists. The Treaty of Versailles, which Germans saw as a humiliation imposed on a nation that hadn't truly lost. The resentment that festered for 20 years and erupted into this new war. Roosevelt was determined that this time would be different. This time, there would be no ambiguity. No one would be able to claim that Germany had been stabbed in the back. The defeat would be total, unmistakable, and undeniable. On the morning of January 24th, the final day of the conference, Roosevelt and Churchill held a press conference in the garden of Roosevelt's villa. Reporters sat on the grass. Armed guards ringed the perimeter. The sun was shining. Roosevelt read a prepared statement about Allied unity and the progress of the war. Then he set aside his notes and began to speak informally. "Some of you Britishers know the old story," he said. "We had a general called U.S. Grant. His name was Ulysses Simpson Grant, but in my and the Prime Minister's early days he was called Unconditional Surrender Grant." The reporters leaned forward. This was new. "The elimination of German, Japanese, and Italian war power," Roosevelt continued, "means the unconditional surrender by Germany, Italy, and Japan." Churchill, sitting beside him, maintained his composure. Later he would write that he was startled by the announcement, that the phrase had not been in their agreed-upon statement. Other accounts suggest Churchill had approved it in advance. The truth remains disputed. What is certain is that from that moment forward, unconditional surrender became Allied policy. There would be no negotiations with Hitler, no armistice, no separate peace. The war would continue until Germany, Italy, and Japan laid down their arms completely and submitted to Allied authority. The policy was controversial from the moment it was announced, and remains controversial today. Critics argued that unconditional surrender prolonged the war by giving the enemy nothing to hope for. If Germany knew that defeat meant total occupation, total subjugation, total humiliation, why would any German soldier stop fighting? Why would any general attempt to overthrow Hitler if the alternative was just as bad as continuing the war? German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels seized on the phrase immediately. He broadcast it across the Reich, telling the German people that the enemy wanted not just victory, but annihilation. There is no hope in surrender, Goebbels proclaimed. Fight or die. Historians have noted that German resistance stiffened after Casablanca, though whether this was due to the unconditional surrender policy or simply the natural progression of a desperate war remains debated. Some historians argue that unconditional surrender may have added months or years to the war, costing countless lives on all sides. The German generals who attempted to assassinate Hitler in July 1944 knew that even if they succeeded, they would have nothing to offer the Allies. No prospect of a negotiated peace that might preserve something of Germany's sovereignty. Would more generals have joined the conspiracy if there had been something to negotiate for? We can never know. But defenders of the policy argue that Roosevelt was right to demand total victory. The armistice of 1918 had left Germany's military leadership intact, its territory unoccupied, its population able to believe they hadn't really been beaten. That ambiguity had led directly to Hitler's rise. This time, there could be no doubt. The war would end with Allied troops in Berlin, with Nazi leaders on trial, and with the complete destruction of the regime that had plunged the world into war. Churchill himself, despite his possible surprise at the announcement, later vigorously defended the policy. "We mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations," he said, "but we do mean to impose upon their guilty, barbaric leaders the ultimate penalty." The debate over unconditional surrender didn't end in 1945. It echoes through every conflict since. How should wars end? With negotiated settlements that leave something for both sides, or with total victory that removes any ambiguity about who won? The Korean War ended in an armistice, and the Korean Peninsula remains divided, technically still at war. Vietnam ended with American withdrawal, and the consequences reverberate still. The Gulf War ended with Saddam Hussein still in power, and a second war followed a decade later. There are no easy answers. Total victory can mean more destruction, more death, more suffering before the fighting stops. But ambiguous endings can sow the seeds of future conflicts. Roosevelt understood this. He had watched one generation sacrifice itself in a war that was supposed to end all wars, only to see their children sent off to fight an even larger one. He was determined that this time the ending would stick. Whether he made the right choice is still debated. What cannot be debated is that the decision made in Casablanca shaped the world we live in. Germany was occupied, divided, and rebuilt under Allied supervision. Japan was occupied and transformed. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. NATO was formed. The post-war order that emerged from unconditional surrender, for all its flaws, has prevented another world war for 80 years. In a radio address a few weeks after Casablanca, Roosevelt explained what he meant by unconditional surrender. "We mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations, but we do mean the destruction of the philosophies in those countries which are based on conquest and the subjugation of other people." Those words capture something essential about what Roosevelt was trying to achieve. He wasn't demanding the destruction of Germany or Japan as nations. He was demanding the destruction of the ideologies that had led them to war. The belief that some races were superior to others, that conquest was glorious, that might made right. It was an ambitious goal, perhaps an impossible one, but it required total victory to even attempt. You cannot negotiate with an ideology. You cannot accept its partial surrender. Either it is defeated completely or it survives to fight another day. That was the logic of unconditional surrender. Whether it was the right logic remains for each generation to decide. These are the facts. On January 14, 1943, Franklin Roosevelt arrived in Casablanca for a secret meeting with Winston Churchill. For 10 days, they debated strategy with their military chiefs. On January 24th, Roosevelt announced that the Allies would accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. These are also facts. The policy was controversial then and remains controversial now. Critics argue it prolonged the war and cost lives. Defenders argue it prevented the ambiguity that had poisoned the peace after World War I. And this is the consequence we still live with. The world that emerged from unconditional surrender, occupied Germany, occupied Japan, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the United Nations, is the world we inherited. For all its flaws, it has kept the major powers from fighting each other for 8 decades. Was Roosevelt right to demand total victory? Or did his words cost lives that might have been saved with a different approach? That's a question worth sitting with. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, consider this. Roosevelt believed that the only way to prevent World War III was to end World War II so completely that no one could doubt who had won. He got what he asked for. The question is whether the price was worth paying. History doesn't give us easy answers, but it gives us the facts and the questions. What we do with them is up to us. Thank you for spending these few minutes with me. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. And if you have a moment, leaving a rating or a comment means more than you might realize. It helps other history lovers find us. And honestly, I read every single one. If this episode made you think, share it with someone who might appreciate it too. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.